Hey, Shalom, Ahchyam, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Ahchyam and Ahkwat that may listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson is going to be a bit of exhortation, for brothers, for brothers who may not, have women. It's This lesson is just going to be a bit of a sentiment of comfort, because for a long time, us as men, as young men, we've tied a lot of our self-worth and value, towards, having the presence of a woman, right? And, and that's part of the culture, that we grew up in, within America and, its affiliates, right? And they push that sort of scenario and thinking that, okay, a man's value is strongly tied to a woman's presence. But when you look at a lot of the ways of our forefathers, it wasn't because they had a woman that made them, valuable. And one of the one of the stories or the accounts that comes to mind was when there was that woman in the Gospels that wanted to grab onto Yahushai's garment, and she had a sickness. And you know what I'm saying? And she had a sickness to the point where all she wanted to do was touch Yahushai's garment. So imagine that. How is it that, as you think about something, as you think about that story, and you think about how is it Yahushai also said how, foxes have holes and dens, but the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. But you know what I'm saying? Like, despite the fact that, not having a lot of these carnal things, he was very well, sought after, right? And remember when he was in the temple and he was confounding all those people, like the doctors and, so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the point was, not to get too down on yourself, if you don't have one. Sometimes you feel that in the flesh, what I'm saying? But, look at it, helps to see it as an opportunity, right? See it as an opportunity to get closer to the Lord. So let me start here. I want to start off with these two precepts, and I'm kind of just going to flow. I don't really have much of a title, but that's pretty much just an exhortation, for brothers who may not have one, right? This is Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 1. And it says here, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them, while the sun, or the light, or the moon, or the stars be darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. Right? So we're in a pretty much in a time where we're remembering our Creator, remembering the ways of our forefathers. We're inquiring, as it says in the book of Job, we're inquiring the ways of our forefathers and looking at the ways and their examples of how they conducted themselves, right? Because the scriptures talk about how the things that are written aforetime are written for our learning. So, we're having essentially an inside scoop of how they, modeled themselves, because the ways that this world models the Israelite man it really is set up to destroy us. It's not set up to actually put us on close connection with Yahweh Ba'ashem Shai, right? So I'll read this again, and it says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. And that's one of the things also I wanted to touch on as well, because when we remember our Creator is remembering, we have an owner, as it says in the Isaiah, the first chapter, how an ox knoweth his owner, and an ass his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, and they don't consider, right? They don't actually consider, they don't even know who they are, who surnamed them, who actually did all those, certain things for them. And that's really the point of when you think about the different high holy days. And all of those high holy days that bring us into remembrance the various, I should say, miracles of the things the Lord did for us in particular times, right? Because we're still in the time of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? So we remember the times and the things that the Lord did for us in in ancient Egypt, right? So that's remembering. That's part of also remembering our Creator, right? So I'm going a little off topic, but just to finish off, it says here, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, right? So just like how we were back then, in ancient Egypt, suffering captivity, remembering the Lord, in this captivity, and we're seeking him, 10 times more, right? Because we know that evil days approach. We know that, there is wars and rumors of wars brewing, right? So we want the Lord to, have mercy upon us, right? It says here, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them, right? So I want to jump. This is another one that came to mind. I went out for a brief walk, and I thought, this would be a good idea. This is James chapter 4, verse 8. And I guess this all ties back into, us having, for brothers who don't have women, right? Look at it as an opportunity for doing these, different things, right? So this is, as I'm going through these precepts, is really to remember, these things also, right? This is James chapter 4, verse 8, and it says, draw nigh to the Most High, Yahweh Bashemel Shai, and he will draw nigh to you. It says, cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep, and let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy into heaviness. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up, right? So this is just, you draw nigh, you give, you spend time, you read, you give attendance to reading, you know what I'm saying? Because, all these things gives us hope, right? Because, we realize that, you don't have, there's nothing to really to hope for in this world anyway. There's nothing to hope for, right? Yes, the Lord, would bless us with certain things, but, you look at the state of the entire world as a whole, it's like, damn, like this is not somewhere you can actually raise family, you can raise children in. It's not a healthy society, right? So, this is, this is not a place we can rest, because it surely will destroy us, right? So this is, going back to, I'll read verse 8 again, and it says, draw nigh to the Most High, and he will draw nigh to you, and cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded, right? So our hearts were not essentially pure. They were, when we, before you learn this understanding, our minds were not, our hearts were not pure, our minds were not pure, right? So our minds were, contaminated. And that's one of the things that Paul told the Israelites in Corinth was, I've espoused you to one husband that you may be chaste and pure, right? So our minds were basically, sophisticated. They were not filtered, I'm sorry, that's the word. They were contaminated with all these different, beliefs and philosophies. And that's one of the things too, is going back to the point, it was contaminated with an idea that we were, you're less of a man if you don't have a woman, right? When you go into, and I want to get an example of this, with different examples of our forefathers in the ancient times. It was, a lot of our forefathers had wisdom. They had gifts. They had wisdom. Being close to Yahweh Bashim Shai. It wasn't because, and a lot of times when you look at it, also they got the woman after, right? But they were very well valuable without them. They weren't valuable, having them, right? And that's one of the things that a lot of our men strongly think about, you know, in this day and age. And when the woman leaves, they're they crumble, right? Because they don't have something that's outside of them, right? So um let me get I wanted to read this. I'll go to this here. um I wanted to get an example of that, of what I just mentioned. This is Genesis chapter 41, verse 33. I want to read it in the Amplified Version, and it says, "Now let Pharaoh prepare ahead and look for a man discerning and clear-headed and wise, and set him in charge over the land of Egypt as governor over Pharaoh." And it says, "Let Pharaoh take action, appoint overseers and officials over the land, and set aside 1/5 of the produce of the entire land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance, and let them gather as a tax all of the fifth of the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the direction and the authority of Pharaoh, and let them guard the food in fortified granaries in the cities." And it says that food shall be put in storage as a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine and hunger, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land people will not be ravaged during the famine. Now the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all of his servants, right? So this is basically a conversation between forefather Joseph, right? And Joseph is basically giving Pharaoh not only an action plan, as he's detailing here, but he's also giving him understanding in regards to his dream, right? So, when you go into Joseph's story, it basically, he gets sold into slavery, and, he has his ups and downs, he has his tribulations, right? But, one time, well, this is one night, the Pharaoh has his dream, and, there was basically news of a Hebrew, of somebody who was able to actually give understanding in regards to these things, right? So this is where Joseph basically came into place, right? Just kind of giving a brief context of what's actually spoken of, right? Because Joseph wasn't at this time, he didn't bring forth his sons as of yet. He didn't have any women and stuff like that. But it just this is the point is really just to show that the ways of the Lord used Joseph, and gave him, he had a gift, he had but the majority of the time, he was by himself, right? So he had moments where he was by himself, like, what I'm saying, like, he was valuable to the Lord. That's pretty much the point I'm trying to make here. This is verse 38 and continuing on, and it says, "And so Pharaoh said to his servants, 'Can we find a man like this, a man equal to Joseph, excuse me, in whom is the divine spirit of the Most High?' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since your power has shown you all this, and there is no one as discerning and clear-headed and wise as you are, you shall be in charge over my house, and all my people shall be governed according to your word, and pay respect to you in reverence, submission, and obedience. Only in matters of the throne I will be greater than you in Egypt.' And the Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you in charge over all the land of Egypt.' And the Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand, and put it on Joseph's hand, and dressed him in official vestments, which basically is it's clothing, of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. So, basically, Pharaoh put him in charge, right? He's now the governor, right? He gave the understanding of not only his dream, but he gave him like a game plan of what to actually do. You know what I'm saying? So, he was essentially very, very valuable, right? And that's pretty much how Jake is in all these different captivities and kingdoms and so on and so forth. When you really look at it, our people are very, very valuable, in we are the ones that make these different, kingdoms and societies great, is really because of our presence, right? Our wisdom. This right. That's why the scriptures say that this is your wisdom in the sight of these other in the other nations. They shall look at you and say, this is a great and understanding people, to roughly paraphrase, right? So, this is, just an exhortation, for brothers who may not, don't have a woman and stuff like that. And, these things get to you, but, understanding that, it's valuable when you're utilizing, even utilizing your gift, right? Because, brothers might have a gift, you can cultivate that even more and let your light shine before let your light shine before men, and they may see your good works, right? Because some brothers, you might have a talent and that's very, very useful, that can actually help, what I'm saying? So, and that's something that Paul, strongly touches on. As a matter of fact, I'll read. Okay, let me get this in Ephesians, actually. One second. This is Ephesians 4:11, and it says, and he gave some apostles and some prophets, and some apostles and some prophets and some evangelists and some pastors and some teachers for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, and for the edifying of the body of Ahchyam, right? So it's, you have, so, you can utilize, your gift because it's meant to edify, and edify means to basically to build up, right? Because, and that's something that Paul also touches on, is, different gifts of, healing and so on and so forth. Like, that's one of the things that, I'll just use myself as an example, is just that I like to kind of reference certain key periods in history, whether it's within the scriptures. Most majority of the time is within the scriptures, to see how a lot of the things that are written aforetime are, written for our learning, whether it might be, ancient customs, tactics, war tactics, spiritual nuggets you can get from different circumstances, insight, learning the mistakes that certain of our forefathers or foremothers did, or even looking at the not the benefits, but looking at also the pluses, the things that they did that were favorable in the eyes of the Lord, right? So, that's pretty much, the point I kind of just wanted to hit. I didn't want to, drag this on too long. I just thought I would just share a little bit of exhortation, and, as the scriptures say, when you're converted, to strengthen thy brethren, right? Because, our forefathers were not seen, they were not basically, their value wasn't tied to Yahweh Shemel. I'm sorry, their value wasn't tied to women. It was tied because they had a strong relationship with Yahweh Shemel. Let me say that correctly. So, anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this was just quick, edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Shemel. Until next time, I say Shalom.